Okay. I've got some things on the board. I wrote 3 topics up there because these are 3 controversial topics covered in Paul's letters: homosexuality, slavery, and the role of women in the church. And many of the letters touch on one or both of these. We touched on homosexuality in 1 Corinthians. We'll touch on it again in Romans. We touched in 1 Corinthians about the role of women in church. We'll touch on that again in the pastoral letters. And we touched on slavery several times. There is neither slave nor free. And tonight we're going to talk about a letter that specifically deals with slavery in Philemon. I put 2 other terms on the board. Episkopoi, which is the word for bishop in later terms, but also in the time of Paul, it is leader or supervisor, not bishop. Then we have the word diakoni, which we get our word deacon from, and that is helper. It's used in the New Testament continuously in helper. When you get into Acts and they talk about the helpers who are administering food to people, they're called diakoni or deacon. So keep that in mind, because we tend to read those words in a translation and translate them into bishop and deacon, presupposing a hierarchical church formation at this point in Christianity. Because what we really have are home churches, and the people who are organizing the home churches, for which those terms fit better in this period of time. Okay, today we're going to talk about Philippians and Philemon. They're not linked, but they're about the same time. They're 2 of the 3 what they're called capture letters, imprisonment letters. Paul is imprisoned, writing from prison in Philemon. He's writing from prison in Philippi. He also in Colossae, which we'll talk about in 2 weeks, 2 sessions, he was writing for prison also. So this brings up some contention. Prison where? We know he was in prison in Caesarea after his last trip to Jerusalem before he went to Rome. He was there for about 2 years. We know he was imprisoned at Rome, and we can infer from the letters in Thessalonians and Corinthians that he had some sort of imprisonment in Ephesus. And so does it matter which one of those? Well, not really. I mean, the theology is what counts. But scholars tend to lean in favor of Ephesus because in Philippians, he talks about wanting to visit them again. And in Rome, we know that he wrote that he wanted to go to Spain from Rome. And in Caesarea, that's a long way from Ephesus. And so the likelihood is that, and he was going to Rome anyway, and so the likelihood that he would want to go to Philippi from Caesarea is also, but it doesn't matter. What's important here is what he says in the letter, the issues he treats, and the theology it evidence. Philippi was named after Alexander's father, Philip. It was the site of that, if you ever read Julius Caesar, the fight between Octavius, who was Caesar Augustus, and Mark Antony against Brutus and Cassius. Remember, et tu, Brute, and John Cassius had a lean and hungry look. That's where Octavius and Mark Antony defeated them. And they settled soldiers, retired soldiers, in the town. And so what grew out of that was a predominantly upper-ended Roman community that spoke Latin on top of the Greek community that had been there that spoke Greek. And so the memorials in Philippi are split between Latin and Greek. It's the first time we've really come across that in this. It's on that Via Ignata, which we looked at when we talked about Thessalonians, because it came up from the Bosphorus Straits, went through Philippi, and across to Thessalonia, and then off to the Adriatic Sea. And so it was a commercial city. People coming up from the Bosphorus Straits stopped there and traded there. There's some discussion about whether this letter also is in several pieces. There are some distinct pieces of the letter, but generally speaking, the bulk of scholars think this is a single letter. It is a little broken up, but they don't think that it's 3 letters, as we found in 2 Corinthians last time. Thessalonians does mention that he had some problems in Philippi. Another interesting thing that we get into here is women are important. At the very end of this, he talks about Eudora and Syntyche, Tyche, 2 women who are heads of churches and arguing. So that has a marker that we can put down when we talk about women in the church and Paul. These are leaders of the church on that. 100 years later, one of the church fathers, he used that term for the people, the bishops who wrote in the 2nd century about activities in the 1st century. And one of these is Polycarp. And Polycarp talked about how dedicated the Philippians were to Christ. And he cites the letters to Philippi, implying that there may be other letters that we've never found, which of course is quite possible, because just some were kept and retained and bound together. There's some issue he deals with. As we found in several of the other books, there are other people preaching in the area that he addresses, and for reasons. He's concerned over conceit and lack of humility within the church, even though he loves them dearly. He talks about the workers of evil, or the dogs. The Romans and the Greeks didn't keep pet dogs much. Dogs were not a term of endearment as they are today. Everybody's got a puppy, a dog, walking a dog. In that time, they did not. And dogs were pretty much a condemnation of people. But he talks about the dogs. And there's some implications of the pending parousia. We found that in 1 Corinthians, where he's talking about some people will be still alive when the parousia comes, when the Christ comes again. We're going to find a little bit different take on some of the inferences of some of the passages in Philippians. He starts with a greeting. All of his letters start with a greeting. He's very warm to the Philippians. He uses phrases like, I hold you in my heart. I yearn for all of you, which is different from what he said in any of the other letters, which means that he had a warm relationship. And we see that with some of the activities that the Philippians do in support of Paul as we get later into the letter. He's in prison. What does that mean? Well, I'll talk about why he may be in prison in a few minutes when I get to what Acts says about Paul in Philippi. But for some reason, he's come crossways with the Roman administration, and the magistrate has put him in prison. When you're in a Roman prisoner, this is not a long term. They don't commit people to life in prison. It's a holding jail for some sort of ultimate judgment. And the judgment is more likely to be beating with rods or something more severe, exile, than it is to go to jail. The jails weren't equipped for that. And you had to feed yourself. If you went to jail, no food. If you wanted to eat, somebody had to give you food, or you had to buy food, or you didn't eat. So there wasn't a menu and a cafeteria for the prisoners in these jails. And so that's part of what Paul is facing. On the other hand, he's not despondent. He says in his letter that even though he's in jail, he is joyful and continuing to preach. And the brothers in wherever he is, we think it's Ephesus, the brothers in Ephesus are continuing to preach and to follow Jesus based on his example of suffering for Christ. We've seen this in other letters that he talks about how one has to suffer for Christ even as Christ suffered for us. And so he's taking a little bit of comfort in the fact that he is suffering for Christ. His life is not his. His life belongs to Christ. There is a couple of verses here where he seems conflicted. Is it better to stay alive and preach, or to die and meet Christ early. That is an implication of the Parousia. It implies that he could die now and be rejoined with Christ, which is a little bit different from he's coming right away, stay in the same situation you are and don't change. Some of the scholars, a small amount, I must add, look at this as he is contemplating suicide. Now, in today's environment, suicide is not looked at. But in the Roman and Greek environment, suicide was an acceptable way out. We see Socrates having taken hemlock. So it's possible but not likely, because he's so full of joy and so enthused about preaching the gospel and preaching the gospel to others that the likelihood of him contemplating suicide is very slim, I think. But that's my impression. The key point here is he is debating that in his letter, whether I want to preach, continue to preach and bring people to Christ, or whether I want to accept death and go on. Now that has an implication of its own. If he's contemplating death and he's not contemplating suicide, whatever he's facing could have a penalty on the other end of death, because that's what brings it to his mind. I mean, it's got to be one or the other. He's not old and is going to have a stroke and die. So it's an interesting set of verses in here. And it does differ from 1 Thessalonians in his approach. And there are a couple other things we'll find where he seems to have a difference from what he said early on in his dealing with the Parousia. The second set of this, he deals with what we call the exhortation, what he's really preaching to the people. Now, I'm going to step back for a minute and talk about Acts, because Acts has a good bit to say about what happened to Paul in Philippi. First, Acts says that when he came to Philippi, he met a woman named Lydia at the gate, and she was the first person in Philippi that he converted to Christ. That's in Acts. Paul mentions none of that. He also is very specific, and this is a story that you should probably all remember, that there was a slave girl in Philippi who was predicting the future. She had some sort of supernatural ability to predict the future. And Paul performed an exorcism and threw that demon out of her so that she was no longer able to tell the future. Well, does that make a difference? Well, people were making money off of her telling the future. They were charging people to come and talk to the slave girl who would tell them what the future was and get cash for it. And so all those people who that was happening for, and the people who were benefiting from the prophecy, were angry, and they brought him before the magistrate. And the magistrate committed him to prison. So that piece, we don't know why, in his own letter, why he was in prison. This is a potential reason. And that the other part of this story is that while he was in prison, an earthquake hit, and the doors to the prison sprung open. And rather than escaping, they stayed in the prison, stayed where they were. And this so impressed the jailer that the jailer and his family converted and came to Christ. And so Acts makes a very long tale of this and why Paul had an impact on Philippi early on. The other piece he comes as he finishes this, he's talking about dissension in the ranks. We talked about that earlier when he said, some say I am for Apollo, some say I am for Peter, some say I am for Paul, some say I am for Christ. It's apparent from his comments that there were other preachers, people claiming to be apostles, who were in Philippi preaching the gospel of Christ. It's also pretty apparent because he doesn't take issue with what they say, only with the, I want to say arrogance, egotistical approach in which they were saying it, which is driving people to sort themselves into different groups as to who they're following. Paul says there is but one gospel, and that's the gospel of Jesus Christ. He said it once before, I believe in one thing, Jesus Christ and him crucified. And so he objects to the fact that there are these different people preaching, even though it's the same gospel, and breaking the community up into cliques or different groups. And again, it runs to the theme that he runs through most of his letters is the unity of the church in Christ. And so anything that's disrupting this unity, even if it's preaching the gospel, is to be thrown away and disregarded because it is disruptive to the church.
Excuse me.
Yes, sir.
Was gospel a term in use?
He used that, yes. It means good news. It was even used, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
It was used, in the Greek word is, I pronounce it wrong, but aigelon, and it is gospel. It was used for the gospel of the emperor, good news about the emperor. It was a common term about other people, not just Christ. Paul uses it for what Jesus meant to us.
Yeah. My interpretation up until your word with wisdom here, my interpretation would have been that the gospel is limited to that which was accumulated, organized by church fathers into the Bible.
Oh, no. I mean, that is the gospel. We talk about the four gospels.
How we refer to it.
No, absolutely not. Okay. Paul is talking about what Jesus did for us, the love of Christ, the sacrifice of Christ, our salvation in Christ, how Jesus came and preached from God. That's the good news that he's spreading. And so that's what he's talking about. There is no book at this point. There's no written anything. Even Paul's letters aren't accumulated into a book. They're separately sent to different churches. And later on, church fathers collect them. And by 340, they become a canon, which included the entire New Testament plus selected books from the Hebrew Bible. But that's way hundreds of years in the future. What we're talking about here is the good news of Christ. Okay?
Yeah. Thank you.
He also implies that there are some external pressures. And scholars apply this. Remember I said there are idols and altars to gods in the town. One of those is the altar for the emperor. And by not worshiping the emperor, we talked about that before, it implies that you are not supporting the town. And if you don't worship the right gods and worship the emperor, you put the whole city at risk. And so that seems to be some of the external pressure against the gospel that he's preaching here. The second part of this, which runs for the 5th to the 11th verses, is something called the Christian hymn. Now, we've seen hymns before. Well, we haven't in this class. But there's Mary's hymn, the Magnificat. There's Hannah's hymn, the mother of Samuel, in the book of Samuel. There's Deborah's hymn in the book of Judges, which are essentially poetry, which may or may not have actually been sung, that deal with the subject at hand. They're praise in a lot of ways. And this particular hymn may have been in Greek. It may have been in Aramaic. It may have been original to Paul. It may have been something that was being floated around and used that Paul took and incorporated into his letter because it conveyed his point. We don't know. And the real issue is, again, as so much of this little historical detail, does it really matter to what Paul's telling us? And so I'm not sure that it really does. The impact of this hymn is Christ as a servant to be initiated. Now this is 56 AD, certainly 1st century. And so what does the hymn mean in the 1st century? He's talking about the divine action versus human action. The things that God does and the things that we should be doing. And that's really what he's talking about here. But by the 3rd century, it took a different meaning. By the 3rd century, it is, and I've talked about Christology before, how you view the Christ. And it runs all the way from Christ was a good man up to Christ is God. I mean, it runs that whole gamut. The further we get away from the beginning, the closer we get to Christ as God. And there are some passages in this hymn that support that. They use the Greek word morphe, M-O-R-P-H-E, and that can be either the exact form of, and it's translated that way, Jesus Christ in the form of God, and that can refer to him and God being the same, or it can mean in the form of God as it says in Genesis, male and female created he them. Either one of those meanings can fit, but by the 3rd or 4th century we take the first vision and we see this as talking about Christ and God being equal, and laying the groundwork for the theological development that Christ was God. And however you train it, he's equal to God, and yet he took on the form of a human and a slave. Now the Greek word for slave is doulos, D-O-L-O-S, which can mean either servant or slave. I mean, so when you read servant or slave in the Greek version, you're probably talking about a slave. When you read when you read servant, you're probably talking about a slave. Paid servants were fairly rare. People bought their servants, and that brings up slavery. I'll talk about that in just a second, but I want to emphasize the fact that in this passage, he emptied himself of anything human and took on the role of a slave to God, and that's what we should be doing as humans, is emptying ourselves and becoming a slave to Christ. God exalted him; every knee should bend, and Christ is Lord. I mean, it's the essence of this hymn. It's a nice hymn. I mean, if you haven't read it, you should read it and look through it. So let's talk just for a minute about slavery. We mentioned it before, and we'll talk about that in Philemon. Philemon's about slavery. We'll just talk about that. But clearly, he's talking about Jesus here, Christ, being a slave to God, and us emptying ourselves and imitating Christ and being a slave to Christ. So that's the key element of this theological hymn. Then he gets to thanking them for their gifts. Now, clearly, the Philippians have sent something to him, and as the story develops, it's a man named Epaphroditus that the Philippians have sent Epaphroditus to Paul to help him in prison, and by implication bring him money to eat and sustain himself while he's in prison. Epaphroditus has gotten sick, according to Paul, near death. And so Paul is sending I'm getting stumbled over this. Epaphroditus back, along with the letter, thanking them for their generosity in taking care of him. And again, that links to how they think of him and how he thinks of them. There's a good, solid relationship between Paul and the church at Philippi, which resulted in Epaphroditus, I think I got that right this time, coming back coming to him and bringing food to help support him. So one of the other things that supports this being in Ephesus is that Philippi is a lot closer to Ephesus than is Rome or Caesarea. And so if the Philippians are going to send him somebody and send him money, it's a lot easier to send him there than it is to send him all the way across the Mediterranean or across two seas. This is where he starts talking about false teachers. I mentioned before, talking about dogs, and this is where he uses the term dogs. And we don't know whether these particular preachers are there now or coming. Remember, he's met these people in Galatians. He's ranted about them in Galatians, and he's implied about that in Thessalonians. So it may be that he's afraid they're coming. It may be that they're there. But it's also clear that, and this term is is not historical at this time, are Judaizers, those who want to enforce becoming a Jew with all of the physical requirements that go with that. And they're preaching that gospel. And this is where he's, like he was in Galatians, pretty hard over against them, in his view, polluting the gospel with the need to be a Jew to go with it. The other piece that comes out of that is just like with the early piece about competitive preachers, it is disunity. The fact that they're there, they're causing disunity in the Church of Christ. And so, A, the gospel is wrong, and B, you shouldn't listen to it because it breaks up the unity of the church, which, again, is a theme that runs all the way through here. And he specifically says about these dogs that, remember, he was a Jew. And all of the following of the law that he did as a Jew did not bring him to Christ. The only thing that brought him to Christ was faith in Christ and preaching the gospel. And so these dogs, like I say, Judaizer is actually a later term, these dogs are really not to be listened to. They're to be rejected out of hand.
Which section is the dogs?
It's in the section between 3:1 and 4:1.
Okay, that's where I am.
Yep. You reading along with me?
Well, I'm trying to
That's all
bounce
right.
around.
I'd rather you read along with me than not read it at all. This is also where he mentions Syntech. I got that word wrong. Eudora, yeah, and Syntyche, Tyche, Syntyche. They're arguing about we don't know what. There's some sort of a conflict. Maybe they are pumped up and my church is better than your church, or my church is better than your church. We don't know. But there is discontent between the two. And again, that's breaking up the unity of the church. And so he wants them to get together and harmonize and get along and express the love of Christ. And he finally ends up thanking them again for the gifts. Now, this is one of the pieces where people break the letter down. They say, well, there was several sections, and one section was the thanksgiving for the gifts. Why is it at the end instead of at the beginning? Why didn't he open with that? Again, it doesn't matter. But there are some letters of thanks, existence, that are not Christian, that end up with the thanksgiving at the back end after he's talked, rather than making a big deal out of it. So the key to this is not where it was written, and it's not how it's organized so much as it is that middle section with the Christian hymn, which is the theological basis of it. It didn't really matter that were other preachers that were preaching the gospel. It was the gospel. What matters there was that they were in discord and creating discord within the church. That unity is what's the important piece here, and not I'm him and he's me, and let's do that. Embracing the law as a Gentile does not bring you to Christ. Only faith brings you to Christ. That's something that's over and over in his letters that we see. Salvation comes from following Christ, having faith in Christ, not from anything else, not from law, not from being a Jew, nothing. And Christ showed the way, like in that hymn, Christ showed the way by emptying himself and becoming a slave to God. And we should empty ourselves and become a slave to Christ. That runs all the way through this. And of course, the unity of the church falls in as a critical piece. Let me talk a little bit about slavery here at the end before we get into Philemon. Slavery was near universal in this community. I have the Jewish annotated New Testament here. Amy Jo Levine edits it. In the back, there's a whole section on slavery. and it addresses the amount of slavery within the Roman Empire and within the Jewish community. Because if we go all the way back to the Torah, and they talk about how you treat your slaves. And so there have been some that say, well, they got rid of slaves by this time, and according to Amy Jill Levine, no, they still had slaves. It wasn't as common as it was in the Roman Empire. But in the Roman Empire, they were at the bottom level, but they were critical to the operation of the Roman Empire. All the food was grown by them. It was harvested by it. They were the stevedores and laborers in the city. Everything was based on slavery. And it was different from the slavery we saw in the American South. It was not racially based. You became a slave by being conquered. They had Britons conquered, they had Celts, they had Slavs. They were an equal opportunity enslavement machine. Whoever they conquered, they enslaved. If you went into debts and couldn't pay your debts, you could be enslaved. You could sell yourself into slavery. If you were a slave and had children, they were slaves. So all of those things were rampant in the entire empire. You could become free. You could become free if you, as a side hustle, made enough money to buy your freedom, which happened. You could be free if you did a deed that the master was very helpful about, liked it a lot. He could free you. You could be freed if the master decided to free you when he died, sort of a will. So there were freed slavery. It wasn't necessarily a lifetime commitment. But the key piece to walk out of that is the Roman Empire could not exist without slavery. And so any thought that Paul should have, as a Christian, and he wasn't a Christian, remember he was a follower of Christ, Christian hadn't been invented yet, any endorsement or quasi-endorsement of slavery is wrong, because he did not have the ability to condemn slavery publicly and often. Because if he did that, Christianity would have died, because the Romans would not have put up with it. Paul's gospel was one of the coming of the parousia. And as we said before, if you are a slave, stay a slave. If you're married, stay married. If you're chaste and not married, don't get married, because the parousia is coming. And that changes a little bit, but it still runs through this whole thing. Slavery is something that was accepted and dealt with. And although he could say that slave and master are equal in children of Christ, that's in their faith and in their salvation, not in their physical attributes. So that's one of the pieces that runs through here and has generated an awful lot of problems in this country, because some of these verses were quoted by Southern preachers to say this is why slavery is important. So that's enough about slavery here. We'll talk about Philemon next.
I think it was also quoted by Northern preachers too.
I'm sure anybody who's going to endorse slavery would find something here, especially the passage about if you're a slave, stay a slave. Slaves, obey your master. Sometimes they skip the master, treat your slaves humanely, which is also in the text. But you're right. You're right. The other question that comes up here is, okay, I got that mixed up. Well, that's all right. This next letter is to Philemon, and it's to a person. Unlike Corinthians, Thessalonians, Galatians, Romans, Colossians, Ephesians, this letter is to a person. Now, we can say the pastorals, Titus and Timothy, are too, but we'll get to that next week, 2 weeks. But why is he writing this to an individual person? And of course, that's the crux of the matter. He's writing to Philemon about slavery. The man who is the topic of this letter is a man named You can call it Onesmus or Onesimus. That's the name of the slave involved. Onesimus means useful. And it's a little bit interesting because in his letter, he says, he's useful to you, but not useful. He's useful to me, but not useful to you. It's a Greek pun. And we never get Greek puns in the text, and there are a lot. We never get Hebrew puns, and there are a lot. And it kind of takes away from the richness of the text. But in this case, it is an interesting piece because of the name and the fact he's a slave, and that what Paul is asking to do here. He addresses it to Philemon. It's labeled Philemon, but in the introduction, he also includes Apphia and Archipolus, Archipous, Archipolus. One's a woman, one's a man, and these are heads of the church. And so, even though he's talking to Philemon, the letter actually has an implication that this is to the entire church. Where? Writers think it's Colossae. The map I sent out showed you where Ephesus, from which we think he wrote it, and Colossae is. It makes sense because if he's imprisoned in Ephesus, Colossae is about 120 miles away, and the slave could easily have come to Ephesus, to Paul. If he were in Rome, that's a really long haul, even though a lot of escaped slaves did, but it's a really long haul. And the implication of this is we are family. Again, we get this family of Christ that runs through here. And the implication of his introduction is very warm to Philemon, and it's we are a family. And because we're a family, I'm going to talk to you about this. He talks about Philemon as a brother. The implication is that he may have baptized Philemon at some point, because there's clearly some sort of a relationship between Philemon, the master, and Philemon, the probably head of a church in Colossae, and Paul himself. It's a very friendly letter. He says he heard of Philemon's Christly love for others. Of course, you could say he's buttering up because he's going to come out in a minute with a big ask. And so he's trying to get him in a good mood. He makes 5 appeals in this letter. He welcomes Onesimus back as a brother in Christ. He also uses the phrase, I feel like a father to him in his service here. He asks that Philemon release him from slavery. He says, if there's any money involved here, transfer it to my debt. I'll pay it. If the guy's a slave and you want to get him free, paying for it is the honorable way to do it. Send him back to me when you get him. I want him back. He's very useful to me. He's helping me. And finally, prepare a guest room. I'm going to come see you. Again, making Ephesus a decent place for it to have been written because it's so close. So he's planning to visit Colossae again. So he makes those 5 requests. He says, I'm an apostle, but he doesn't demand it as an apostle. He doesn't even demand it out of love and friendship. He appeals to him out of Christian love. In other words, he steps down from the authority he could claim and asks it in brotherly love that this happen. They're both children of Christ. He won't keep him if Philemon says no. So if Philemon says, nope, send him back, he's going to do it. But there are some questions here. Onesimus is a slave, but why is he with Paul? The normal routine interpretation, the one I always had already believed, is that he's an escaped slave. He fled Philemon, and he ended up in jail with Paul. And so he became a help for Paul, and so Paul is in Christian love trying to get Philemon to not punish him. Remember, escaped slaves were routinely beaten on the bright side, sometimes executed. And so he's trying to intervene on the side of Philemon. That's one explanation. It's the one I always thought. There's another explanation. There are two others. One, Philemon sent him to Paul, just like the Philippians sent their man to Paul, to help him in prison with money. There's nothing here that says he was an escaped slave. All we know for a fact is he was a slave and he belonged to Philemon. So perhaps Philemon sent him as a slave to Paul to help Paul while he was in prison. And Paul wants to keep him. And then Paul wants to get him set free. That's quite feasible. There's a third one that I never thought of, and that it was a habit in Rome, a tradition or a cultural issue, where a slave who felt he had been wronged by his master could appeal to one of his master's friends for that friend to intervene with the master on behalf of the slave. You have done wrong to this slave. You've broken the habit. You've broken the tradition. It wasn't fair what you did. Can we get this thing straightened out? Because he really doesn't want to run away. He just wants justice. So that is another alternative. I'd never heard of that before, but it's possible. All we know is Onesimus is here with Paul in jail, and that Paul is appealing to his boss to take him back and release him, and to bill Paul for whatever it is. But Paul makes a very concerted point at the end in tying him about their brothers and all the rest, that although he's offered to do this, he's made it virtually impossible for Philemon to say no. It would be very tough for Philemon to say, I don't care. That would be very unchristian. And so he's laid that out to make it very difficult. He says, do more than I ask. And then he's got a final greeting at the end. So this 335 words, that's all this letter is, 335 words. And when you look at commentaries on it, they can be 40 pages long. You know, I mean, in a commentary per word, it's got the greatest density of commentary of any of Paul's letters. It's truly amazing what they do with it. So, what are the issues? He's a prisoner. He's a brother in Christ. Paul wants him to be taken back by his master and, at the very least, forgiven, accepted and put back into servitude and not punished, or at the far end, released from servitude and sent back to Paul. So that's the point of all of this. But there's an implication here that is different from what we saw, if you're a slave, stay a slave. And that is, he's looking to get Onesimus released from slavery. And so that has an implication for how Paul, at this point, is thinking about the Perusian. Because if he was dealing with, if it's a slave, stay a slave, if you're unmarried, stay unmarried, because next Tuesday, like a thief in the night, Jesus is going to come, it wouldn't matter. All he'd want him is to get not punished. So that's an implication that he never clarifies, but it's an implication of the issue. It's clear to him that the cross subverts the status quo. In other words, Onesimus, being a brother in Christ, subverts the status quo of master and slave to some extent. And indeed, it subverts almost all of the Roman and Greek relationships and practices. And so that's one of the key pieces we walk out of here with. And the power of gospel to transform relationships. And this is something, if you know, I normally say you have to read all of this in the light of how it was written and how it was read in the century in which it was written, which I think is a good guide for most of this. But this is something we can all take to heart. We can all see that the power of the gospel is there to transform all relationships. The relationships within the church, the relationships within the community. And that takes us through the two, not the two shortest letters. Philippians is a little bit longer than some others, but certainly the shortest letter of Philemon. What kind of questions can I answer for you? I guess I put everybody to sleep today. She's been threatening to go to sleep since I woke her up to come.
Why did they think the bruiser was going to come so quickly, and when did they finally figure out that it wasn't?
Well, I think figuring out that it wasn't
Was time?
was a long-term piece.
Okay.
The farther we went, and when people died and he still hadn't come, and the generation that knew Christ had passed away and he still hadn't come, it became apparent that our assessment that he's going to come next Tuesday is wrong. He's going to come, we just don't know when.
He never said he was.
Because
gonna
Jesus
come
said,
right away.
no man, only the Father knows.
Yeah.
Although he also said that some of you are alive today. You know, so it was a long thing. I see it here in Paul between stuff written in 52 and stuff written in 56, or attributed to 52 and 56, that he's coming to grips with the fact that it's not going to be imminent. It's not going to be right now. Would he have written, stay unmarried, stay married, stay a slave 10 years after that, or not? I don't know the answer to that. But it would seem to me that he has changed his approach a little bit. I am not a minister, and I don't have a PhD in Bible studies, but it's my interpretation of it. You can scream for me to be burned at the stake if you like. Other questions? Gene, is this all making sense to you?
Yeah. In first century terms.
Yeah, you have to read it in terms of first century. If you're reading it in terms of 22nd century, you are reading things into the text that may or may not be there. But Paul may not have been thinking about that when he wrote it. They write for what's now. From their perspective, is what they're experiencing and the problems he's facing. That's where he's writing to. He's not a seer of the future. His name's not Edgar Case. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I'm always trying to, because I'm reading so much these days. When he says at the bottom, greetings to you from all these people, Mark.
5 people, right.
5 people, Aristarchus, Demas, Luke.
Mark and Luke are in there.
So Luke wrote a gospel, or was credited with.
Was credited. That's the correct term.
Doctor, or was said to be a
That's
doctor.
credited. If that's the same Luke.
We don't know. Okay, that's what I wanted to ask you. Do you
That's
think
if-
it's the same one?
What I
In
think,
your historical research?
no.
You don't think that's the same? Luke?
One of the things that ties Luke to this, Luke a person,
Mhm.
is that Acts changes tense partway through the book.
Right.
It changes from third person to second person. And of course, Acts is attributed to Luke. It never says, I, Luke, am writing this. Acts is attributed to Luke. And no, neither Luke nor none of the Gospels are personally attributed.
Oh, it says dear.
Yes, it's sent to somebody, or it says, Dear Theophilus, which means lover of God,
Right,
is
right,
what Greek means. But it has been that attribution has been made because of the shift in Acts and the fact that Paul cites a man named Luke with him.
Mm-hmm.
And so that has been drawn. It's also been drawn about Mark.
Right, that's the next
Yeah,
question.
there's no documentation of that. And in fact, there's not even anything in Acts that could make implied that that might be true.
Well,
We just don't know.
Yeah, I agree, and I mean, we don't know, but the fact that we can't find documentation isn't enough for me not to.
Here's
No,
the
believe
thing
it.
to think about. Nobody attributed it to those people until the middle of the 2nd century.
Right. I
They
know.
were originally called the first gospel, the second gospel, but they weren't, and they weren't numerically the way they are now. In terms of when scholars think they were written, Mark was written first.
Right.
Matthew is first in the New Testament because the church fathers loved Matthew. And so they made Matthew first, and they generally interpreted Mark as being a pirated copy or a condensed copy of Matthew.
Other way around.
And so they put it in. Current scholars think Mark was first and Matthew was second, and that Matthew and Luke used parts of Mark. The first time I read the New Testament, I was sitting there reading it and said, I've read this before. I've read these exact same words. And so there are word for word quotations or sections in Matthew and Luke that are found in Mark.
Right. I know that,
Okay.
and yet Mark also, some say, was actually maybe dictated to by Peter, that he traveled with Peter. I read it in
We
a
don't
very
know.
reliable source.
But they don't.
I don't, in scholars, right, I mean,
Let me put it this
scholars
way.
disagree on these issues.
They do. They disagree on almost everything. Okay?
So there you go.
Now, of the books that I sent you a text today, email today, of the books I'm using
Okay, good.
for this, none of them would tell you that Mark and Peter were tied at the hip.
What did I read just this morning that said Mark? And I did read something.
It's a
just this
it
morning.
is a Christian traditional attribution. That's correct. They were people trying to tie the names to the Gospels, and that's one of the ways that they look for a link to tie it to the Gospel. And it is true that even though John, according to the New Testament, was illiterate, John could have dictated, and somebody else wrote it down. It's possible. I mean, all of that's possible. We don't know a lot of this.
Or he could have learned to read, because he was the youngest apostle.
Yeah, but not
He was
likely.
probably about 14. Now, he could have learned to read somewhere along the line before he reached his old age.
If he did, he would have learned to read Aramaic.
Right.
And John is clearly written in Greek, and written in good Greek.
Well, then he probably had a
Right.
scribe. But the thing is, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't change the gospel.
That's a good point. Excellent point.
Yeah.
Like I said about the historical documentation here as to what it was, what does it say about the theology? The theology is what counts.
Right.
You know, the theology is what counts. And so whether these letters were written from Rome or Ephesus or Caesarea, they were written in prison, and they were written for a reason, and the reasons are what I've been trying to lay out here. And that's what you should think about. It's your relationship with Christ and God that these try to help you find your way. You know, and so you can get lots of arguments about who wrote it when and how that all happened. You can get in arguments about, as I did in a class on gospel, one of the guys raised his hand and said, who took notes on all these speeches? You know, John doesn't list parables. John talks about things that Jesus said that last 2 chapters long. Who took notes? Who knows? Yes, ma'am.
Do any of these original or these writings still exist
No,
as a papyrus, or is it
No.
just that
no.
they were transcribed originally and then?
The earliest manuscript we have of New Testament documents is dated from 145 AD, and it's about a 2-inch square of the Gospel of John. That's it. The other gospel, the other manuscripts, hard copy manuscripts that we have, are from much later than that. The bulk of the manuscripts are from the Middle Ages, when they were copying and sharing. There is no original document for any of these. They just don't exist. And they were written initially on papyrus.
Should have hidden them like they did the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Well, we have original documents in the Dead Sea Scrolls with the Hebrew Bible.
I know we did.
And there are different versions of the Hebrew Bible
Yeah.
in the Dead Sea Scrolls.
I think why I asked the question is not so much I need confirmation of who wrote them, but I'm very interested in the relationships between these early apostles. I just have this, I was really enamored with sermon series that Ralph Raleigh did a long time ago on the disciples, you know, and how they went out to, you know, to preach to the various places in the world, and then, you know, and they're the people that they touched. It's sort of that networking effect that I just find that to.
With the exception of Peter and Paul, we have very little substantial documentation of where the apostles went.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to have fun, get a copy of something called the Golden Legend, which dates from 1200 AD, which tracks the life of all the apostles and where they went and how they died. There's no other documentation about that. I mean, there are legends. Thomas in India.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are lots of legends, but that's what they are. They're legends.
Well, I mean, like Philip was in Ethiopia, right? Is that in Acts?
No, Philip stopped an eunuch who was Ethiopian on his way to Ethiopia and found him reading the book of Isaiah, which presupposes a number of things. And Philip baptized him, and he was on his way to Ethiopia.
Okay.
Then Philip returned to
Caesarea.
right. I mean, other question? I really don't want to get into a theological argument about who wrote what in the Bible. I mean, it's contentious.
Well, as I said, that's not what I'm interested in.
Right.
It's the relationships and
Right.
who they came in contact with.
And if you're comfortable with the books the way they're written, that's perfectly fine. We're talking about faith here.
Problem is, nobody wrote all that down, so we don't have anything actually to look at about
Well,
between the disciples.
See, I don't necessarily say that it was not written down, because
Well, we have
look
found
how
it.
intensely personal it is, especially when it's quoting Jesus. Now,
Oh, I see.
you think that
Okay.
I think it's the revealed word of God. That's, you know,
In the Bible.
right.
Okay.
Now, maybe it came to somebody who happened to be writing it down in the Middle Ages. I tend to think not. I think someone learned probably
You can say
did
that.
write it down or did commit it to
Okay.
memory.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just hard to
Possible.
imagine, you know, when Jesus is talking to
We
Nicodemus.
just don't have any definitive historical verification of that.
That's an assumption. I mean, that's an assumption.
Well,
But it's possible.
the basis of our belief system. You know, we are not to prove, and I'm not trying to prove it or trying to argue. I swear I'm not arguing. I'm just saying it's belief. It's the belief that you have,
Okay.
and it's the foundation of your belief that the Bible is the revealed word of God.
Okay.
And because I'm a scholar and an academic, I tend to think that that Jesus chose the people that he surrounded himself with, both because of their courage and their wisdom. A lot of things, but because their courage, their strength, their wisdom, because they were willing to put it all on the line for him eventually, after, you know, as he taught them, they were teachable. And so somehow they lived in close contact with him. They were disciples, and we're disciples in some sense. We're just so much later. So understanding that, what his relationship, even you, I have such great admiration for what you're doing, because you're teaching, you're there, you're studying, you're teaching, you're thinking it through, and you're sharing it. That's really outstanding, and that's what, I really admire it. So,
Okay, it's fine.
Not an apostle.
I'm not an apostle.
Peter,
I
on
am-
this rock I will build my church. No,
well, you're a type of
not that
disciple.
Peter.
I mean,
No,
it's kind of a discipleship, right? It's kind of a servant.
I put stuff out there and you can evaluate it
Yeah, everybody has
and
a
accept
different
it or
approach.
not. Because like I say, what's important to each one of you is your faith.
Yeah.
And coming to Christ and the gospel. That's what's important to you. And we learn about some of it here. Any other questions?
And not just hearing our faith, but doing our faith.
Yeah, you have to
right.
do
Like
it.
Theo was talking about today.
Imitate Christ, as Paul says.
Right.
Now, we will not meet next week. Karen and I are going to Greenville, South Carolina to see our youngest grandkids over the weekend. But we will meet the following week,
But
and we'll talk about Ephesians and Colossians. Then, and these are the last two of the. We don't know if he really wrote it or not. The scholars are contentious about whether he wrote it or his disciples wrote it. We'll talk about that.
So is it just because more time has gone by than when a lot of us were growing up, we didn't have these discussions as to who wrote what?
Right.
We just, this is who it was, this is how it was.
Right.
And so people have just, in the past 50, 60 years, just delved deeper into it to find out that, maybe this
There
wasn't this
wasn't
person.
People delve deeper into it starting around 1700.
right,
Right.
there
But-
wasn't as much scholarship, but I don't think people with individuals like we are within churches were questioning and
No,
were
I mean,
studying.
I'll call
this
it
way.
popular scholarship. Those of us who are not
I mean, the Catholic
spending-
Church definitely was.
with doctorates in academia, because most of this was done in academia in seminaries, where they were reading and writing about this and trying to establish what this meant. And some of the 19th century scholars are still quoted on what they found.
And at the end of the day, like Gail says, does it really matter?
I don't know, but it's hard.
Well, it is hard.
It's
When you
what-
grew up one way,
it's your
you're thinking this, and
I
and
grew up
then
the
all
same
of a
way you
sudden
did.
They go in and they say, "Oh,
I have my King
Well, and
James
it's
Bible,
called
roughly
growing.
apostle.
Yeah, I grew up.
But that's called growing in your
Yeah.
faith. When you start questioning and thinking through and not just accepting.
And that's what's happened
Yeah.
more recently.
I mean, you can look at people like, and you'll probably shudder when I say their name, but like Rick Warren and people that are putting out things that have it more like
Popular,
maybe
pop-
they,
popular theology.
oh, maybe that's what it is. And it even seems like in some of the seminarians that are coming out, they're having different beliefs of what is really actually in the Word and how it's interpreted and than we had growing up. And you just go,
How many different Christian sects are there?
Yeah.
oh,
And how many translations?
Do you have
of
an
the
answer
Bible?
to that?
I do not.
Okay.
I mean, I have a book that is
Yeah.
called the Encyclopedia of World Religions that I could go through and count them all. But I couldn't tell you. It's just, we had I won't leave his name off, a church council once. He said, Christianity was a straight line belief until we got to Martin Luther. And I said, no, it was not. Christianity started with a myriad of beliefs about who Christ was and how he brought the word, and it just over time necked down until Martin Luther and then it went this way again.
Yeah.
Because you've got the Calvinists, you've got the Lutherans, you've got the Unitarians. It all just split and scattered. I bet if you drew a circle of 5 miles around here, you would find 20 churches.
oh yeah.
The big split in the 1400s where the Eastern Church split from the Western Church, the Orthodox and the Catholics, big split. And they've reconciled to some extent, but they excommunicated each other.
Well, you just want to get it right. I mean, you want to get it right. because a lot is depending on kind of if you get it right. But it's like my son-in-law, one of my son-in-laws, when he came and saw Candy, he was Baptist. And when he came and saw Candy in the pulpit, he about had heart failure. You
As
know,
a
oh,
woman,
gosh,
you mean a woman?
there's a woman in the
Yeah.
in the altar. Well, but he's changed. You know, he's accepted. The same thing with, you know, when do you say that this is, I want to say gospel, and this is just maybe my thoughts? And I guess that's my thing, is that you want to get it right.
Everybody's searching for ground fruit.
Yeah,
You have to-
and
you
I
have
don't
to
know if
define
you're
it.
ever
You
gonna
have
get
to take it
I
on
don't know if
faith.
you're ever gonna
You
get
have to define it. I can't tell you what to believe.
Yeah.
And in fact,
But see, that's why I didn't want you, that's why I went to the Bible.
Right.
But
Yeah.
when I see about women, or what I see about slavery, or what I read about homosexuality, and then you come out and you go, but, you know, we want to err on the side of love, which
Yes.
I love that. But then you hear other people that say, but you know, these are the words of God, or these are the words of Jesus, and it's just,
But
Everybody,
Jesus
there's
says,
so many
"Love your neighbor."
interpretations.
well.
To me, that sums it all up.
But it's interesting because he and Kristen went to a church that some of the Bible churches, the women still are not allowed to teach if a man is in
It's
the
going
class.
backwards.
my New Testament scholar,
It's interesting.
my New Testament professor, is a lady named Carla Works. And she went to Dallas Seminary, I think it's called. It's a Baptist seminary. She went with her husband.
You told me that story.
And they were in class, and the guy was calling roll, and they got to them both, and he said, so-and-so Works, and Carla Works. And he says, are you two related? He said, yeah, we're married. And then he turns to her husband and says, you can explain all this to her when you get home.
Oh.
She's a Methodist now.
Yeah. She left the
So
Baptist church.
you can't have pastors like Beth Anderson and Megan and,
Oh, no.
and
She's a woman of
Pia
action.
without thinking that they belong in the pulpit.
No,
I mean, you know, you just, but it's just, anyway.
We have a friend in Tennessee
World changes.
who goes to Presbyterian USA, which is a very
Conservative.
literal church, and women can neither preach nor teach. Can't do it.
Liberal conservative,
Got to be a man. So
even in the Sunday schools.
What, really?
yes, yes.
So they can't even preach with just a women's group?
Good for a women's group, perhaps.
maybe a
I don't
women's
know.
group,
She doesn't
but
go to a
not-
women's
not
group,
that.
but
Wow.
And it's huge. And like you say, a lot of these new Bible churches, or whatever they're calling them, that are recruiting and getting so many young people in, and I'm thinking, these young women are going backwards in time now and believing that they can't have a say in
Right.
any of this. I don't understand the thought process. It's very different. I don't know. Anyway, if it's what people need and what brings them to God and to Christ, fine.
we went to their Sunday
That's their
school
choice.
class. It had 300 people in the Sunday
It
school
was
class.
huge, gigantic.
Now,
church.
my Sunday school class on Sunday has 2 people,
One and me.
and
if
one of
I'm
them I'm
there.
married to, so she kind of has to go.
Yeah, you follow where your husbands teach, don't you?
I'll
So
be back. Fine.
anyway, it's all different, and you have to make your own path. And reading and asking questions helps you improve your faith. That's what Reggie says.
Yeah.
Reggie never complains about people who question
And
things.
Reggie, if you ask him a question, he won't answer you. He'll say, "What do you think?" Or he doesn't like to answer. He wants you to use
Yeah.
your brain and
You
work
have to
on it.
find the path that works for you.
Yes, right.
And do research too. I mean, I think there's a lot of different, I mean, that's the scholarly tradition, which I do kind of believe in that, which is that tradition of you find something that you don't understand, you go to different sources to, you know, who are different sources of scholarship to try to figure out, you know, what it means. I mean,
One of the basic sources that I would recommend to you for this is the New Interpreter's Bible Study, which is a 12-volume commentary that has a section on each book of the Bible. And it has It has an essay at the beginning of the book that kind of goes through all of the issues that are around it in modern scholarship. It has the NIV and the NRSV side-by-side translations, and it takes in sections and it will provide commentary on those sections, long commentary on those sections. And then at the end of that, it has a section on the theological implications. And so if you want to do basic research in a single set of, and they have that in the library here, I would recommend that.
Mhm. Well, I mean, I don't want to go through from cover to cover. I've enjoyed I'm the third year of reading the Bible one at a time. You got me started. It's your fault. Now I do it all the time.
It's my fault.
It's like addiction. I just can't stop reading it every day.
But when you find a section that bothers you, go to the Bible commentary and look that section up and see the two different translations, and then read the commentary on that section. You don't have to read the whole thing.
Well, I mean, there's lots of stuff on the web too.
There are some web things that are good, and there are some that are not.
Yeah. Well, I know that. I mean, I'm a professor,
Right.
so and I tell students that all the time. But you know, I mean, I think that I would just say that the one-year Bible blog is really good. For example, as you're reading through it, but then there's going to be a question almost every day where I'll say, what's where, you know? And I've got some of my own books, yeah, but they're all, you know.
Every time I ask Reggie, have you read this book by such and such? He looks at it and he says, okay, that was published by so-and-so, and that press deals with this kind of theology.
Yeah.
And so this particular author has a natural bent toward this. Because every author has a reason for writing the book.
Yeah, right.
Every single one. Nobody writes a book because he woke up one morning and said, I think I'll write a book about Revelation. You know, something kicked in that says, I need to write a book about Revelation. Because it's a lot of work to write a book. And so you gotta come to grips with what the biases of the author may be.
Yeah. Well, and also, sometimes they just need to get tenure, so that's.
Well,
But you know, we are really blessed to have Reggie because he's got to be one of the most well-read.
he is. He's my go-to guy, and he always hands me another book. He said, read this one.
It's also
Okay,
interesting.
a
Maybe
lot
I
of the
won't ask
spots where in my Bible that's got the notes at the bottom of it, that when I have questions and I go for that one, that's one that they don't have a note for. Which is really frustrating.
That's why.
Okay, well,
That's
I'm not
why.
alone in
That's
this,
why I
then.
recommend
Not
that
that
big
one.
Yeah,
multiple
that's
volume
Yeah.
Bible commentary, because it has stuff on every verse.
Wow. Because I was also using, I think it's Haley. Is that one? Haley?
Well, it depends on how big the commentary. Remember, 12 volumes is a lot.
Oh, yeah,
The
yeah.
volume I'm
Haley's
using, I
is
have
not that
2
big.
volumes
Yeah.
on the classes I'm teaching,
Yeah,
and
wow.
they're each this big.
Yeah. Pretty good. Okay.
So
Other- yes, sir.
in sum, the remaining classes all shift 1 week.
1 week shift, yes. We'll finish a week later than we originally thought.
Yeah, that's too bad.
You'll miss
In my
Romans.
case, I'll miss the last one,
You'll miss Romans.
which is the most important one in my.
Romans is the most theologically compact or
Well,
impacted
It'll
book.
be recorded.
It'll be on record.
Yeah, that's sure.
All right, let me close with a section that Paul wrote in Philippians, as a matter of fact. Finally, beloved, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is pleasing, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, and if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. Keep on doing the things that you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, and the God of peace be with you. The me is Paul, not me. Anyway, so we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you. I'll see you in the morning if we don't.